I might just preface it by saying, we're from yesterday and into this morning, we're getting quite a bit of overview and high level of the landscape. And now as we go through the rest of the day, we're going to start to get a little more tangible. We're going to get into some workshops this afternoon where we're going to start working in smaller groups, talking about things in a little bit more detail, granular level. And this is meant to sort of give some food for thought for that, to begin to connect the dots around how to think about systemic issues and work on them in a systemic way, and then begin to understand the relationship of engagement of citizen stakeholders, policy, and capital. So with that, Georgia, take it away. We'll try to get through this pretty quick.
Great, thank you. So I think it's worth, we've just had some fantastic context setting already, but I do think it's worth to always start with what we're up against. This isn't anything new for anyone, but I think it is, again, an invitation. The reason why we have a mission is to get very clear that the business as usual plus a little bit more just simply will not suffice. And so when we think about the role of policy that's currently supporting this business as usual, what do we need to do differently, particularly given the scale and pace required? So yes, this is an urgent priority, but also it can be a competitive advantage. Now, what I've got up here is an example of the hard coal industry in Germany, which over a 50-year period, of course, with structural policy reforms, reduced its coal production and is now a innovation hotspot for green technology and energy production. So they have a competitive advantage now, but that took 50 years. We don't have 50 years, but we do have an opportunity to take a leap forward and learn from what has been done before us, particularly in the role of using policy. So, as you will be familiar with NetZeroCities, we've undertaken the Climate City contract, which every city has, and it's become really clear in outlining the pathways to radical emissions reduction that there are a number of key delivery gaps. And so that's what we're going to focus on today.
All right. One key component of the Climate City contracts is the development of a capital investment plan. And it's really to connect the dots between the commitments that the various parties to a Climate City contract are making with each other together, as well as the actions to get to climate neutrality and the action plan where we're trying to identify structural barriers and the pathways through that. We also ask cities to start with what naturally begins as a pretty high level look at how much capital is going to be needed to do this over that entire period of time. It's a little different than traditional budgeting processes for cities. It's meant to start at a very high level and then inform how we get to more specific, more granular information about what's necessary to move this forward. And so these capital investment plans start with a tool to sort of model what needs to be done. And this is just an example to illustrate. Almost every city is in a similar situation where we have various sectors and various things that need to be done. And we can start to estimate those in general terms and then get more specific as we go forward. And one of the reasons why we built this is because in order to mobilize this kind of capital, it's going to require, and we'll come back to this more in a more pointed way, it's going to require quite significant policy work, both at the local level, but also from national governments. Thankfully, we have national platforms starting to help with that conversation. And when we think about those policy needs, we have to think about the engagement that's necessary to get those policies. And that's not possible if we only focus on a very narrow perspective around decarbonization. We have to think about what it is that's front of mind for political leaders, for people in the community, et cetera. Carlos began the day talking about that, as how people live in the city, et cetera. So we know that there are multiple issues. People care about health, they care about social cohesion and be feeling connected, not isolated. They care about the economy and their economic well-being, security, et cetera. All of these things are related and they need to be part of this process. What that means is we need to look at the economic components of that. What does it mean economically to have a healthier population in our city? We're making interventions to reduce carbon emissions from vehicle use and transport, for example. That's having a huge impact on air quality, which has a huge impact in saving money in the healthcare system, right? We need to understand that that's the total economic picture. It's not just about the emissions. And so we build tools to help to estimate that in a variety of different ways. And we'll get into this, I think, a little more detail in the workshop this afternoon, but just to give you an introduction to that, let's go to the next. And then we can begin to get more specific, shifting to public transportation. What are the costs? What are the benefits? Even at a high level when you think about co-benefits. And what you see is the benefits, including co-benefits, are massive compared to the costs. Now these kinds of analyses have been done at a very high level, saying it's a much better deal for us to invest everything we can to transition to a more climate resilient and sustainable world than to adjust and try to deal with whatever comes our way. But we're struggling to make decisions in real time because we're not bringing that level of information into our specific engagement and specific policy activities. And this is meant to help us get closer to being able to do that. Next slide. I'm just going to use one example. City of Stockholm created a congestion charge many years ago. That's a whole presentation in and of itself, how they did that and what was smart about it from a governance perspective. What I want to do here is just show you that with that in place, they were able to put together a massive investment to expand their subway system that draws upon capital from multiple sources. So instead of a business as usual financing where you have to look to government to come up with the whole 25.7 Swedish kroners, the government's only putting in, what, maybe a fifth of that? Congestion charges, which are people paying to drive, is probably covering about a third of that. And then the rest is coming from a variety of sources, from the state government, city government, property owners, and a couple other municipalities who are dependent upon that subway system, right? So that's only possible with, you can only engage in those kinds of conversations if you have that kind of data and you have the kind of tools that can help you analyze how this is going to play out and what the benefits are. So we can start to get to some of these ways of working. I'm just going to shift gears a little bit from that and talk a bit about the process of how we help cities begin to think about that. And are you going to?
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, and so on that, I think the underlying point is, as we know, no lever works in isolation. And so that comes with having not just a deep understanding of the problems that a city is facing, but the system dynamics that underpin them. So what is it? Why is there not a conversation at a city level that looks at the co-benefits and has the capacity to price those alongside capital investment? So it's really getting a sense of how do we start having better informed conversations in order to invest fully and get a number of co-benefits at the same time. And so some key examples of that is here. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk specifically in this context about energy systems and development, but this isn't about the what, it's about the how. How do we help cities learn how to work this way? Because it's a little bit different than business as usual. And I'm going to start with a bit of a preface, which is when we think about the trajectory that we're on and where we need to get to, the one thing we have to accept as a given is that we are not going to achieve that outcome simply by accelerating our incremental work. We have to work in a different way. What does that way look like? And a lot of work has been done over the last 20 years at looking at trying to use district scale models and place-based innovation to begin to understand how to deliver what could ultimately happen citywide in a defined place. And part of why that's really useful, it does relate directly to the concept of 15-minute cities from a planning perspective as well, but it helps us think about infrastructure and the built environment in a fundamentally different way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this context. So, and this is based in Canada. We have our guest from Canada here who may know a fair bit about this. And I just want to say there was a large redevelopment of a brownfield in the city where the city had a unique moment in time where they could look at all of the infrastructure and understand the planned development and think about systems, technological systems, all at once. And they used that as a laboratory, a real world laboratory, to try to test out different models for that. One of the things they wanted to see is if they could deliver carbon neutral energy in a neighborhood scale system, which is not the norm for how we deliver our energy in our cities. We have very large utilities, and we have very micro scale technology, and we have nothing in between. So this was an opportunity to sort of explore that space in between and say, what could we do? And there's a lot more detail we can get into, we won't now. But what that really meant is the city had to take on some new processes around planning. And it had to work with the stakeholders in that particular defined geography. And it had to have an explicit mindset of this place isn't about how we've done things everywhere else. It's about trying new things. So we're going to break the rules. We're not going to assume existing regulations are how we have to do things. We're going to create new rules. And that required the city ultimately to get some changes to the charter at the provincial level so they could do some of the things that were necessary. They had to create a new entity to do this, so they had to develop a whole new governance process, and they had to think about capital in a different way. But they did all of those things successfully and were able to come with a result. And I think the key point from this slide is they aligned policy, scale, and capital. And these district or neighborhood scale approaches are where we are big enough to connect scale with capital and policy in a way that mimics the entire city. And that's really important because we cannot work citywide. We have to work in ways that we can manage and operationalize. Let's go to the next slide. This just gives you some data on how the project turned out. And at the end of the process, the city did the feasibility work, understood the technological options, and then did a business analysis. And when the time came for decision making around are we going to do this or not do this, the finance director who was engaged in this process from the beginning was part of the process and determined how the business analysis was done. And the engineering department for the city who was there throughout the process. They, prior to that, had no experience in energy. Got to the end of this process and said, the only way this happens, it's quite technologically simple. The business case is pretty solid. But the only way it happens is if the city does three things. If the city has to do those things, they're not earth-shattering, right? But they're still risks that the city's taking. If that's the case, why would we give the return to somebody else? Why take the risk and give the return to somebody else? This is a revenue-producing asset. And part of the finance director's rationale was, my cost of capital is better than the private sector's. So if it's a good investment for the private sector, it's a great investment for us. Particularly when we have to understand we're going to need to do this across the rest of the city over time. We need to understand that there's an economic rationale to drive this and that we can attract capital to do this. So those are some of the takeaways. Very quickly, what that led to was a process that started with this one district, we're going to try new things and test what's possible, to the most important thing about what happens in that district is what happens outside of that district. If we do all this work in one district, but we've done nothing to figure out how to make that extend across the rest of the city, then shame on us. We need to intentionally plan for what happens next. And so it designed incrementally a phased approach to expand that system, which it's done over time. Over the last 15 or so years, and it continues to perform with radical reductions in greenhouse gases and financial performance that is better than what the private utilities are delivering. Next. In addition, it got the city planning, the city engineering departments thinking about this in a more holistic way and ultimately connecting to the housing folks and saying, okay, what's coming up in this city in terms of major projects? And how do we start planning now to replicate that process in those projects so that we're ready when they happen rather than being caught off guard and missing those opportunities? Because when you're digging up streets, when you're putting in making improvements in the sewer system or the water system, when you're putting transit in, that's the perfect time to begin to intervene in thinking about place-based neighborhood scale energy systems. So it just changed their process. It sounds very obvious, but it's not how things normally work. So a big innovation in one place led to a change in how the city works across the entirety of the city. And then you could take that to other cities. And the reason I put this slide up is the takeaway from that process from an energy performance perspective, that's one of the big domains we need to problem solve in, but I would also say it helps with the rest of the 15-minute city problem. Mobility, housing, interaction, connectivity, data, access, et cetera, is to see the city not as the city, but as a series of interconnected, interdependent parts where you can deliver specific solutions in a specific place that take advantage of the immediate local conditions. In some cases, like in Vancouver, the project captured heat from the sewer system because it was right there, right? That's cheaper than the groundwater, so the economics are better. And it is very simple technologically to do that. In other cases, you have to do other things. And you could borrow heat from the river. Depending on the density of development, you can do distributed heat pumps, whatever. There's a lot of different ways to do that. But each neighborhood is going to have its own solutions. And that's really important in this process, is to be able to have a process that doesn't try to do one thing everywhere, but do all the things you need to do that are specific to that place. And that requires a different way of working. It requires us bringing new capabilities and mindsets into the process and really taking advantage of the opportunity to make some of these hard problems a little bit smaller so we can tackle them with an idea that then over 10 or 20 years, you can tackle multiple problems at this scale rather than look at the whole map and say, there's no way we're going to do this. It's too hard, the politics are too hard, et cetera. And I'll never forget a conversation where somebody in the planning department said, but we can't do this here because in this other neighborhood, they're never going to go along with that. And so we talked about that for a while, and it's like, well, maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the neighborhood that's the least interested in new things, that would rather live in the 50s, maybe they don't matter. Let's go to those places that really want to try new things. They have that dynamic of, we're here to create our future rather than wish we lived in the past forever. Next slide. Last thing I'm going to tell you is a little bit of jujitsu around economics. So most of us have seen this, this cost curve. This was done in 2007, I think, by McKinsey to basically illustrate some things are cost effective, some things are not, and broke those down by activity. This was based on US data, but it applies everywhere. The reason why I want to use this is when we talk about building renovation, and that's a hot topic here for all the cities, when we talk about building renovation and we think about climate neutrality, it's important that we focus on the outcome that we want, not what the current market is willing to do. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So we used real data on building energy improvements in a city. And we picked those things using actual data from past work, and we said, okay, how does that perform economically? If you did everything in those buildings to reduce energy use by 30%, et cetera, so to give you the possibility of getting to climate neutrality, what would you do? So you would do all of those blue things. Well, finance people generally will tell you, do all of the blue things below the line now because they pay for themselves. But if the objective is to do all of those things, what if you model that? And that's what that looks like. And it's really important that cities reckon with what it means to drive the energy conversation in your city. Because that capital pays for itself. That's an investment. But it's not capital that's readily available to individual building owners to do this work. Right? It's a difference between 5-year, 7% financing versus 4%, 12-year financing based on actual data. 4% 12-year money is not hard to find, but you're only going to get it with scale and policy. Individual properties will never get that money. It's the city's job, if we're going to get to climate neutrality, to learn how to do that. And here we have this wonderful opportunity with the national government supporting the cities to take these steps forward. So I just want to take you through that a little bit because fundamentally you're going to be told many, many, many times it's not cost effective. Well, it depends on who you ask. Capital is not capital. There are many kinds of capital. And if we're willing to work at the right scale and use policy to build capital or to build scale and reduce risk, we can get that capital. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more this afternoon as well.
So I guess that comes to the point where we say it's about money, but not just about the money. because alone they are insufficient, but again, coming back to Thomas's point, it's the process by which we put a proposition forward that can then fund the kind of work that needs to be done. And so specifically, we're talking about levers like policy and regulation, but not to the exclusion of others, of course, citizen engagement, capacity building, etc. And so the question here we'd like to, in these last few minutes, to really engage with is, how can policy serve the mission? And I'm putting this into three categories. Like, how are the current policy and regulatory instruments that you're engaging with, how are they currently advancing mission objectives? And I'm using the example of the built environment so we can get a bit specific. Versus, what are instruments that are maintaining the status quo, that business as usual curve? And actually, what are in play, what are the instruments in play that are actually weakening or undermining the mission? So a few examples here, and I'd love for you to reflect on and think for yourself, like, what other ones you can see quite visibly. But in terms of supporting regulations right now, yes, at the EU level, we have things like the directives on energy and green public procurement, and also energy efficiency schemes. But what else is in play right now that is actively looking to disrupt the business as usual curve? What is stabilizing the status quo? If we think about the built environment again for a moment, is it that there needs to be a change in national regulation, or is it more the implementation and enforcement of what already exists that is meaning that we're not moving the dial? When I think of no testing spaces, it's asking, do we have the space at a national level or even local level to experiment? Do we have policy studios? Do we have regulatory sandboxes that actually test and explore and ask these questions? And then it also asks, what are we currently subsidizing that is keeping the status quo the way it is? And lastly, it's getting really discerning and understanding what is directly undermining or weakening our trajectory. And there are a number of things that are in play. These are just a few examples from cities around Europe and the world, and I'm sure you'll have specific examples that come to mind too. But things like outdated zoning and land use regulations that incentivize a certain kind of development or certain kinds of materials being used. The ongoing discussion around how much we still subsidize fossil fuels, for example. And of course, the limited financial incentives or the conservative financial markets, again, because we're not having the kinds of conversations we need to have to raise the capital that is necessary. And so really to reflect on the power of this platform, the Romanian platform, is understanding what is the range of low and high stakes actions. Like, what can we at a national level mobilize around? And again, these are just examples. In terms of taking the lead on policy interventions and enforcement, what can Romania nationally do that takes the pressure off cities having to enforce or move forward? How can you at a national level also catalyse the scale of finance needed? And that might be also through joint procurement, for example. But even at an EU level, I'll pass to Thomas in a moment, but one thing you've often discussed is, how do we think differently about EU directives that have an outcome-based energy standard rather than a prescriptive process standard? So how do we have quality conversations at a national level that inform the kind of directives that are going to assist us at an EU level? So really, what can mission-driven policy innovation help cities with? I'm going to run through this briefly, but firstly, it's looking at what are unhelpful assumptions and practices in policy making. Basically, how do we make better decisions and how do we make better policy that informs that holistic but specific approach? How do we better understand and utilise the knowledge and the powers we already have? So what's already in the toolbox that we have, but we're just not implementing or enforcing or have the resources to? How can we get tangible? A number of cities, of course, in Romania have already got the label and they're already looking to implement their Climate City contract, and others are on the way. But how do we translate this into actionable policy interventions? And I would add to that, there are a number, all right, at the city, local, like regional, national level. How do we prioritise them? And of course, how do we create spaces to test new policy ideas? So creating dedicated spaces for conversations like this, such as policy innovation studios or regulatory sandboxes. And how can we make sure in doing so, we're practicing that collaboration, we're working across city departments and diverse stakeholder groups, and then vertically as well, at a local, regional, national and EU level. So a brief snapshot at who we're currently working with at NetZeroCities. At a national platform level, the conversations we're having that are using this mission-driven policy innovation lens, the systemic lens, the Finnish cities, and discussion around transport barriers. Again, this is a complex challenge. It's not a change of one bit of legislation and things get better. It's complex when it comes to the topography of certain cities within Finland, when it comes to the behavioural change required and the multimodal shift. In Greek cities, we're in discussions at the moment and understanding how do we streamline the procurement process or the licensing of projects so it doesn't take 5 years in order to mobilise from the preparation of a project through to completion. What does that look like? And the Polish cities, understanding the barriers around debt ceilings. How can we fund this transition? And Norwegian cities, and understanding the port emissions. So we're still refining the scope and the brief of this, but it starts with creating the space to look systemically at the challenge at hand and then get specific as to those supporting, stabilising and undermining policies and how they interact with the role of finance, citizen engagement, technology, capacity building, etc. We're also working with a number of cities within the mission as well. And here, for example, Vitoria-Gasteiz, understanding there is a clear window at the moment for a review of the urban planning, the spatial plan for Vitoria-Gasteiz. And so how can we be embedding the mission objectives or understanding how spatial planning can, of course, enable and advance the mission ambitions. In Guimarães, looking to the private industry in particular and the engagement strategy, where the conversation doesn't just start with how do you work with us and how do we make sure the regulations don't impact you too much, to going, how do we create a textile industry in Guimarães that is more competitive than anywhere else in Europe? So having a conversation around what are the policies that sit behind those questions so that they are enabling for that transition rather than restricting. And with Amsterdam as well, looking at what does a shift in food strategy look like, moving from a reliance of 40% of plant-based to 60% plant-based in Amsterdam. And what's the role of the city in facilitating and enabling a food strategy that is more resilient and less carbon intensive? So what now? So at the moment, we're exploring the creation of a Romanian policy innovation space. We've got a session this afternoon on policy innovation, and we're looking to have a number more if you're open and excited to engage in that too. And also looking at coordinating the national platforms and domain groups throughout Europe. And so what can we learn from each other in terms of these conversations as well? So that's all I have for now, unless there are any questions. I don't want to hold everyone up from having their coffee, which I'm sure is overview, but quick moment if anyone's got anything. Okay, we'll leave that there.
Many thanks.
Thank you for having us.